In this week's In-Ear Insights, let's talk about rules, specifically rules around communities. Over the weekend, in one of the Discord communities I'm a member of, there was a big kerfuffle, a substantial conflict among the moderators and administrators of a community. Different people say, all sorts of emotional drama. Someone saying this, you're showing favoritism to this person, and there's no process written down for how do you deal with this kind of situation. And one of my responses back as part of the moderation team was to say, well, and Katie, I was channeling you.
I'm so sorry.
I said, a big part of the problem here is that we have relatively few, like 13 written down rules.
Mm-hmm.
We have no standard operating procedures, and we have a long list of unwritten rules. And we've often said in the past that culture, like a company's culture, is essentially a list of unwritten rules. These are the things that no one writes down and says, like, here's the ways we behave, or here are the thing, here's who we like, and the sort of the cliques within an organization. But there's still rules that if you want to be fully integrated into that community, you have to abide by the unwritten rules as well as the written ones. And I said in this particular situation, there were some rules that clearly need to be written down, like who's in charge when the head administrator is not in charge, when they're not there. But what's your take on that, Katie, on the unwritten rules of community? And when do you decide, okay, this kind of needs to become a written rule versus just something that's part of the informal culture?
So to take a step back, yes, you definitely need to have some sort of a org chart of who's in charge when the head moderator's not in charge. Like that, that makes me nervous. And I think it's funny because when we think about like our community, analytics for marketers, we have some unwritten rules of who's in charge and who's not in charge. So it's sort of unwritten that I'm the lead voice in analytics for marketers. I ask the question of the day. I kind of keep things running. It's unwritten that, Chris, you are the analytics experts. And when people have questions, you chime in. And then it's interesting to think about. I don't think about it too often because it's like, it just kind of happens. And I think that's how these unwritten rules come about out of necessity. You don't really sit down and think about, what do I need to put together? What is this going to look like? It just kind of happens. And I think that that's one of the reasons why companies don't want to necessarily write down what the culture is going to be, because some of it needs to happen organically. If you are dictating what the culture is going to be, that's no longer a culture. It really is just a set of rules. Culture is something that is a combination of all of the different diverse people included in the community, and by telling them how they can and can't act, that again, sort of, that's not culture. That's just a set of rules. That's just dictating the behavior. And sort of like, showing up on your first day of kindergarten and suddenly finding out that, you have to ask permission to use the bathroom, or you can't eat whenever you're hungry. You have to wait for a certain amount of time. And those things, they're not fun. That's not really like you expressing yourself. And so I feel like there's two topics. There's, how culture comes about in a community, but then how many rules are too many rules, I guess, or what are the needed rules for a culture and for a community in order to keep it on the rails. So, Chris, when you're describing, what was going on in your Discord community, of people complaining like you're showing favoritism, this, that, the other, like that to me doesn't strike me as a rule that needs to be written down. I mean, obviously I don't have all the context. That just sounds like somebody who was having a bad day and taking it out on the community.
Well, so to be clear, this is within the staff team. This is not in the general community itself.
I see.
This is infighting among the staff.
I see. Then, yeah, I mean, when you sign up as a moderator or, a team member, someone who's in charge, then those are expectations that should be written down. That's not, I want to take culture and responsibility in two separate buckets. And so what you're describing is a lack of expectations around responsibility versus the culture that's being set. The culture that's unwritten is, let's all be nice to each other. Let's have fun. You can write those down as rules, but then what that actually looks like is what happens more organically, more unwritten. But what you're describing to me sounds like, yeah, everybody who's on the moderation team needs to have a set of expectations and written down, job descriptions essentially to say, you do this, you don't do this. When, Katie's out of town, Chris is in charge. When Chris is in charge, everybody else, falls in line, whatever the stuff is. That's not culture. That's just, basic do's and don'ts.
Right. Which in a lot of online communities are absent, right? Those
Mhm.
those are things that don't exist. In the context of marketing, very often, communities that are run for marketing purposes just kind of inherit the corporate culture of the company
Mhm.
that's running it. The analytics for marketers Slack kind of inherits the trust insights culture by default because
Mhm.
we're the ones running it. But in a purely volunteer community like the one on Discord, there is no corporate rule and culture, and the people who are mostly in charge are people who don't have enough life experience in organized systems
Mhm.
to even know that something is missing. For example, um, one of the things I brought up is that there really is no defined, mission and vision of the organization as a whole, and as a result, the decision-making process that the moderation team uses can be very capricious, and very, very unfocused. Oh, let's try this. Oh, let's do this, as opposed to saying, "Here's our mission and vision.
Mhm.
Does this decision or idea or whatever promote that or detract from that?" And without that sort of north star, it feels like, yeah, a lot of the decision making is random or very, on the whims of how people are feeling that day.
Mhm. And so even with a volunteer community, there should be some sense of an owner, is there not?
There is, but that person is largely absent.
Ah, well, I think you found the problem, Chris. But that's a really good point, though, because there's still, even with something, whether it's an online community or an in-person community volunteer organization, even if people aren't getting paid to give their time to moderate, to run things, to, keep things on the rails, there still has to have a sense of ownership of who is in charge. And so what you're describing, Chris, is basically nobody's in charge. So therefore nobody's being held accountable to do anything. And when people give suggestions, there's nobody to say, yes, let's do that, or no, let's not do that. So let's put that aside for just a hot second, because I do want to come back to that. But when you're talking about communities, there does need to be someone who at the end of the day owns the thing. And so with analytics for marketers, we own the community. We're the ones responsible for the safety of our members, for making sure people can get in and out, for the user experience, for all of those things that, if someone has a problem, they know who to come to. We are the admins. And so we own it. Do we have to run it necessarily? We could completely step back and not run it at all and identify, different people to run it. But those people would then still be looking to us to say, what is it you want me to do? Because if we're not giving them direction, then what you're describing, Chris, is what then happens is just kind of pure chaos and nobody's in charge. It's not great.
It's actually worse than that. There's several different people who all think that they are in charge,
Mm.
and they're fighting with each other because they're like, "Oh, I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge," and it's a very disorderly.
And this is a good use of your time. Why?
These are people who entertain me.
Oh, fair. Fair enough. There is definitely that entertainment value. I think, we get a lot of questions about how to set up a community or what are the best practices for running a community. And, you're giving a really great example, Chris, of why having some basic roles and responsibilities and rules and ownership in place is really key, because unfortunately that infighting amongst team members does leach into the community itself. And community members, they're very, aware of what's happening around them. They're there for a reason. And if the culture of the community of, team members fighting, that it gets uncomfortable, people start to leave. This was something that we were talking about a bit last week of what happens when the community starts to go sideways because nobody's in charge. You may lose community members because of that. You may be destroying what you created because the leadership team can't get their acts together.
Exactly. And even just basic, simple operating procedures and stuff, which, I used to be allergic to, are
I know you still
are,
are.
to- are
It's
totally absent.
it's more of just a annoying itch at this point. It's totally manageable.
It is. There's a cream for that. For example, how do you know when to ban someone? Right. So that's a really straightforward question, except that it isn't.
Mhm.
So there's, in my head, at least when we were having this discussion, there is sort of the longevity of a member who should play a role into it. Someone who just pops into your community, signs up, 5 minutes later just starts spamming. Like, okay, that's pretty easy. Ban that person because they're just here to seagull in, make a bunch of noise and leave. And that's a pretty safe person to ban. On the other hand, if you have someone who maybe has been in your community for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and something changes about their behavior, right? Do you ban them with the same vigor that you do with a spammer who just stops by to hawk their latest NFT? The argument I've said is it depends on how egregious the violation is of the written rules, right? If they start parroting, say, anti-Semitic content, like, okay, you got to go, like that's pretty clear. That's not okay. Start putting in misogynistic memes, like, yeah, it's time to go. But for other stuff, there's a big gray area in general. Like, how do you decide when do you privately message someone, sort of give them a warning, and then ask them to go or just boot them out the door? None of that is defined. None of that's written down, and those are rules, processes that administrators of communities need to think about in advance.
Well, so let's go back to, the anti-Semitic, oh my goodness, why do I struggle to say it?
Hate speech.
Hate speech. Thank you. let's simplify. Let's go back to hate speech. I always think about it in terms of would it hold up in court? And so, sure, I don't like hate speech. I don't want to see it in my community. But if I don't have any rules written down that say that it's a violation of the community guidelines, and I kick someone out for doing it, and they say, well, nowhere was it written down that I couldn't do that. That's always something that you need to consider. And it's okay if your guidelines change. If you figure out, okay, people are spewing hate speech because I never said they couldn't do it. Let me go ahead and update my guidelines. Then at least I have something to hold them accountable to. So I always try to think about, obviously it's a little bit more intense, but like, would it hold up in court? And so, Chris, if you happen to just pop into my community and started, mansplaining the heck out of me, sure, it would be annoying, but unless I explicitly had rules, I would have a hard time, bouncing you out of that community, even though it makes me and other people very uncomfortable. And so that is where you have to really consider how deep into those rules and regulations do you need to go. And that goes back to the ownership of the community. I've had people reach out to me, not so much these days, but early on in analytics for marketers of, I saw so-and-so doing this. Can you remove them? No, because it's not written that they can't do that. Just because you're annoyed by their behavior doesn't mean that I, as the admin, need to go ahead and remove them. And those are the things that, you need to have someone in charge to deal with. Be like, I will take that under consideration. Let me recheck the guidelines. Let me see what they're doing, what the violation is. And then maybe it is a warning system of like, hey, I've been getting complaints about this kind of behavior. Could you tone it down, knock it off? Maybe this isn't the right place for it. But then the person who's committing the violation has every right to push back and say, nowhere in your guidelines does it say I can't do this. And that's where, you have to have them written down. Again, that's not a culture thing. That's just the straight guidelines. The culture to me is, how lighthearted or how far you push the line of not safe for work things. And again, those are all things you can have written down of, you have to have a G rating on all of your posts or else, this is not the community for you, for example.
Side note, there's a great podcast. It's called You're Wrong About, and I was listening to it this weekend about how movie ratings developed. Go look it up. It's a lot of fun. It's about an hour and a half long, and you realize, talk about a capricious system that has no rules. It's completely arbitrary. That's a good thing to listen to. So I want to go back to rules though, because we're talking about adding things into rules. I'm going to read aloud here from the Analytics for Marketers community. Rule number 4 is do not share or create prohibited content privately or publicly. This includes sexually explicit content, hate speech, spam, fraudulent content, sadistic gore, animal cruelty, promotion of self-harm and suicide, child exploitation, private confidential information, content promoting illegal activities, and malicious content such as viruses and malware. If you see prohibited content, please report it to a moderator immediately. So that's a pretty wide-ranging rule. The question I have, and this goes back to something you started the show with, is how do you know when you're at too many rules, when you're starting to document every little thing? Like hate speech is pretty broad, but somebody could ask the valid question: what constitutes hate speech for the Analytics for Marketers community?
Yeah, and that is something that we would then need to decide on, like, where do we draw that line? Because you're right, it is a pretty broad stroke in terms of what it could, what could fall under hate speech. I feel like it's sort of the same thing with process. Like, process for the sake of process is too much process. Rules for the sake of rules are probably too many rules. It's, but it goes back to what is the purpose of the community, in general. Like, we created Analytics for Marketers to create a space for people who are interested in both analytics and marketing and have questions about it and, want to connect with other marketers and analytics professionals. And so we were pretty clear about what we wanted it to be. We're also pretty clear about what we didn't want it to be. And it's not a place for people to just, sell their stuff. We don't want them to pitch their thing. We want people to show up and relax a little bit and feel like it's a safe place for them to ask questions that they may not be able to ask to their teams, their bosses, their organization. And so with that being our North Star, we can then decide within each of these rules, how far do we take them? If we were to say no conversation that doesn't include the words analytics or marketers, we could absolutely make that rule, but then we would probably have a hard time getting people to stay in the community. And so when you start to get down to that granular level of rules, I think that's when, are people enjoying themselves? Are people meant to enjoy themselves? Is this strictly a professional, like very corporate, very black and white kind of thing? And for us, it's not. But I can definitely see where there are going to be communities that are, nope, you stay on topic. This is not the place for you to not stay on topic. But you have to make that choice. And that starts with, what is the purpose of the community?
Right. So for a community that is sort of the total Wild West, how do you roll out those new rules? How do you start defining those processes? Whether it is a community that you joined, that you have responsibility for now, which is the case for a lot of the places I'm on in Discord, or a community that you own and you're starting from scratch, like Analytics for Marketers. How do you start that process of creating both the written rules and the culture?
So the written rules are fairly straightforward. You just write them down, you choose them, and then you start to roll them out. But then it's not a one and done. You have to have buy-in from your team members, the other moderators, to say, I will help enforce these rules. And if you can't get that kind of agreement, then that's your number one problem. You first need a team of people, or, even if it's just you, who are willing to take the time to not only create these rules, but also enforce them, to carry them out. It's like maintenance. You buy a piece of software, it's not a one and done. Someone then has to maintain it to make sure it's working, whether that's minimally like 1 hour a month or, every single day. And so that's the first choice that needs to be made of, do you have the time? Do you have the team to enforce the rules before we even write them? If you don't, that's where you need to start. Then you decide what's the purpose of the community. And then the rules should all align with here's the purpose. I mean, to your question about, the mission and the values, that's a great thing to put in writing. We don't believe in hate speech. We do believe in people having fun and, having a safe place. Those are two pretty good culture drivers, because then other things can sort of fall into line. You don't have to have written rules around how people show up and have fun. Everybody's going to do it in a different way, but as long as they aren't violating the hate speech rules, they can go ahead and have fun. You don't need to write down and dictate what that looks like.
And I'll put in a plug here, again, sounding exactly like you, that for your community, put yourself in the community's shoes. Say, as a marketer, I need a safe space to network with colleagues so that I can ask questions that I don't want to ask in front of my team or my boss. That's one of the user stories we came up with for Analytics for Marketers. And
Absolutely.
that key phrase of I need a safe space to ask questions is one of the defining principles. And so there would be, when we do stuff like ask questions about pineapple on pizza, in that context with that user story, that is totally aligned because it is a safe space for people to ask questions and network with others, right? It does not detract from that user story. If we capriciously said, only people who dislike pineapple on pizza are allowed in this community, that works against that rule because now you're excluding about 40% of the population.
And me. I would no longer be allowed in my own community.
Exactly. But I think having those user stories also is helpful because it helps you think about your community from the eyes of a community member.
And that's a big part of it, is you want to make sure that at the end of the day, it's about your community. Building a community it's like building a team. It's 100% not about you. You as the manager, as the owner, are just the person who is making sure everybody else can get their job done. As a community manager, as the owner of the community, your job is kind of like being the cruise director. Like, your job is to make sure everybody shows up and has fun. Hi, I'm Julie. I'll be your cruise director. But then you just kind of fade into the background and let people do their thing. You've given them their guidelines. You've given them the itinerary. You told them what the weather's going to be like today. You've pointed them towards the all-you-can-eat buffet, and then you just kind of fade into the background and let them do their thing. And that's it. Like, that's your job. And but there's a lot of work that goes into becoming, having the ability to fade into the background. Like, there's so much work that goes into it. I think that's the part that people don't understand, is if it looks like we're not doing anything, that's because we are doing everything, but we're just doing it really well.
And that brings up two things from this weekend's kerfuffle. One, without that sense of purpose, people kind of feel like, oh, if we're not just doing activities for the sake of doing it, people don't think we're doing anything, which is kind of a bit silly. It's like, if you're a farmer and you've weeded the field and you've watered everything and stuff, you don't have to be out there, micromanaging your crops. You just let them kind of do their thing.
Right.
But the second part that we ran into is some of the team members who are in conflict with each other. It's because of ego, because they want to be seen as sort of the star members of the community.
I know it's a podcast and people can't see my face, but that's dumb. That's silly. You're doing it wrong.
But that brings up, I think, an important consideration for community management, which is it's difficult to be a community manager and an individual contributor at the same time because you have conflicts of interest.
It's the same thing we have about being a team manager and an individual contributor. You can do both. You absolutely can do both, but you need to set some boundaries around what that looks like. So when I'm the team manager, this is, the things that I'm responsible for. When I'm an individual contributor, I'm not managing other people. I'm just doing my thing, getting it done, and moving on. And so it's the same thing with community manager and individual contributor. Chris, you sort of you act more as an individual contributor in our community, but you are technically one of the community managers. Fortunately for you, I like being community manager and not an individual contributor. So I like to just sort of like see people do the thing. And so what I would recommend is see if you can find at least two different people to do those two different things. If you want to be the rock star, don't be the manager. If you want to fade into the background, don't try to be the rock star. It's, you can do both, but it's so much cleaner, so much easier if you can do one or the other. Now, again, we can all wear different hats. We can do both roles, but if you have the opportunity to find different individuals to do the different roles, it's going to be that much cleaner. And so, Chris, in that Discord community that you're talking about, what's your preference? Do you want to be the community manager or do you want to be the individual contributor?
I am 100% the community manager. I contribute very little.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no desire to be, other than, occasionally publishing something here or there. For the most part, I'm happy to just be the man behind the curtain.
Mm-hmm.
This morning somebody came and spammed a bunch of stuff and just went in and hit the ban button. Okay, they're gone.
Yeah, that's why you like it.
Exactly. But there's no fanfare. There's no big
Right.
announcement. There's no posturing. It's like, boop, you're gone. And that's totally appropriate for me. I feel like that's, it's also a good use of my time, right? Because I can devote 30 seconds, a day to the community just to handle administrative stuff and things like that, and not be the person, promoting and being loud about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think one of the challenges that a community manager would run into when they're looking for people like that to join the community as staff members, volunteer or not, is that if you are basing your selection process on who is the most vocal and active participant, you are by definition choosing someone in a management role based on individual contributor metrics. And that's probably not the direction you want to go. If you want people who just are going to stay behind the curtain and quietly mind the machinery so that the community can flourish on its own, choosing someone who's the loudest person in the community I feel like there's a big conflict of interest there.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And it again, it kind of goes back to, what is the purpose of your community? Do you want, a cruise director who is constantly, bringing the fun and the life of the party? And that's fine if you want that person. I wouldn't also then put them in charge of the admin, because what ends up happening is then people have a hard time seeing that person as both roles, as the fun person and as the enforcer. It's not that they can't do both. Again, it's sort of, it can happen, but you need to set those expectations up front of, I'm going to bring the party, but I'm also going to tell you when the party's over. So, I don't know, Chris, I kind of feel like I am that person. But
to your point, we need that role.
Yeah. It's the other thing with that is, I think it depends on how big the community is, but there is such a thing as too many people in charge. And it sounds like, everybody wants their 15 minutes of fame, their little piece of glory, their, spotlight on the stage. Maybe this isn't the right forum for them. Maybe this isn't the right way for them to go ahead and try to get that fame, because you already have 10 other people trying to run a single community. You don't need that many people running it unless you have millions and millions of people from all over the world in a community. I'm going to take a wild guess to say that's not how big this Discord community is. It might be big, but I don't know that you need that many people trying to be in charge. That's never going to work because of all the egos.
So it is a community of 950 people.
Oh my goodness.
With 3 administrators and 7 moderators.
You don't need that many people. You really don't. We have 3,000 people in analytics for marketers, and we have basically 2 admin/moderators, period.
Yeah.
And it's fine.
It is fine. Now, in fairness, a good chunk of those folks are like sort of like individual cruise directors of their own little section. Like one person's in charge of the music section, one person's in charge of the video section, one person's in charge of like the writing and contest section. So it's not like it's a free for all for everything, but
Mhm.
there definitely is. It definitely is a little top heavy.
And that's when, to go back to one of your original questions about culture, that's when you see, in companies or communities, in this case, the culture starts to get really murky because it is too top heavy. You have too many people trying to steer the ship and not enough passengers who wanted to get on the boat in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it sounds like for people who are interested in building these private social media communities,
Mm-hmm.
you absolutely do need rules. And it's something we
Mm-hmm.
talk about. You can download it in our free paper on the topic on the Trust Insights website. Having those defined rules is important. Having an org chart and job descriptions is a really important thing, just to say, like, here's what is needed, here's what
Mm-hmm.
needs to happen, and here's who's doing it. And then that mission and vision that says, here's the guiding principles that this community exists for a reason, so that we can make decisions effectively, whether it's 2 moderators or 20.
Mm-hmm.
If we know the purpose, right, the first part of the 5 Ps, if we know the purpose, then we can align all of our decisions around that.
And I would say, based on what you're describing, Chris, I think there is some value in having both internal and external rules. Maybe you have some guidelines around, and here's how we, as all the moderators, have to make decisions. Now we have to make decisions by committee. Yeah, that sounds super painful, but you might weed out some people who don't want to do that. And that's great because you don't need that many moderators. But setting some expectations internally that people don't see, externally, the community members don't see, here's how decisions get made. Here's how we put together our EdCal. Here's how we decide the activities or the channels or whatever the thing is. I think that would be a really smart thing to do. But again, that goes back to who the heck is in charge, who's owning the community so that those things can be put in place. And if you can't get to that answer, then, none of this is ever going to come together.
Exactly. If you've got a community of your own, or you're thinking about a community of your own, and you've got questions about how to run it, pop on by the Analytics for Marketers Slack community. It's not just for analytics. It's for you if you need a safe space to ask questions about the challenges you're running into in marketing, customer retention, community management, whatever is on your mind. If you want a safe space to ask those questions and get some answers, join us and over almost 3,000 other folks at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. And wherever it is that you watch or listen to this show, if there's a channel you'd rather have it on instead, go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast, where you can tune in the channel of your choice. And if you have a moment while you're on those places, leave us a rating and a review. It really helps to share the show. Thanks for tuning in. We'll talk to you next time.